Welcome everybody to today's event at ODI. So today, really excited, we're going to get a sneak preview, although I've been told it's a very small preview into CDC's new strategic impact objectives, which will be valid for the next 5 years, I think starting in 2022. But also we're going to hear from an incredible panel of leading experts and industry leaders, I think, on the resonance of these objectives from the country kind of perspective, so on the ground. But also I'm hoping to be able to create some lively discussion, perhaps on some of the opportunities, but also some of the challenges within these tensions and what CDC may be up against, if you like, in achieving those in the next 5 years. So my name's Sam Attridge. I'm a senior research fellow here at ODI, and I spend all my life when I'm at work investigating and understanding the operations of Dfis. And I'm going to be your chair today. So I think I'm going to be quick because there's not a lot of time. So there's no doubt, I think, that CDC is actually one of the world's leading and most respected bilateral Dfis. And it's especially valued for its uniqueness vis-a-vis other Dfis in terms of its geographic kind of focus in Asia, South Asia and Africa, but also most notably for its deployment of equity capital. So it's quite a unique, special institution, and I think we should be proud of it here in the UK. It's also been on quite a significant journey, I would say, since 2012. And we've seen quite a transformation in CDC, not only in terms of its investment approach, but it's also seen quite a significant growth in the size of its portfolio, thanks to kind of the UK government's increased capitalisation of it. But also, and why we're here today, an increasing focus on its development impact. And I think these new objectives, signal that this is a continuation of that journey and what we can expect in the next 5 years. The theory and thinking behind these objectives, Paddy's published a paper, you can publicise that, which has led CDC to develop these objectives is published. And I think that the thinking behind it is relatively, I think, not controversial. And I think kind of economics kind of room 101. But one of the things that struck me when I was reading the paper that's been published is that actually, if you stand back and look at DFI investment patterns, on the whole, they don't necessarily tally, I think, with the paper and some of the thinking outlined in that paper. So I found that quite curious. And I think that's why these new objectives are so interesting, Paddy, because not only, I think, will the pursuit of them be quite challenging, but I think they're going to necessitate quite a change in the portfolio composition and how CDC goes about investing, but also how we think and measure impact. We talk in the paper about spillover effects and transformative effect. I think it has some significant implications for how we go about measuring and managing that. Anyway, enough from me. We have a wonderful panel, a distinguished panel. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to do a very short introduction, which won't do their impressive biographies that they sent through justice. So please accept my apologies. So to my right, I'm delighted to welcome Mohan Vivekanandan, I hope I got that right, who's the Group Executive Director of the Development of Origination and Coverage at the Development Bank of South Africa, which focuses on sustainable infrastructure development and financing across the African continent. Mohan's also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council on SDG investment and the OECD-led Fast Infra initiative. Joining us online, maybe Namita, you could give us a wave. We have Namita Vikas, who's sitting in India. She is the founder and managing director of Dfis ESG, which is a global expert advisory firm on sustainable finance and ESG investing. And Namita is a senior business leader and banker with over 30 years experience. We were just hearing she played a significant role, I think lead role in the issuance of India's first green bond back in 2015, and has a long list of impressive accolades, including being ranked as one of the leading women in business sustainability by the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. So we're delighted to have you with us, Namita. And we also welcome Mavis. Mavis, if you could give us a wave. We have Mavis Owusu Jamfi, who is the Executive Vice President at the African Centre for Economic Transformation, which is a leading African economic think tank, who focus a lot of their research on sustainable development and inclusive growth in Africa. Prior to that position, Mavis was the Director of Investment at the Power of Nutrition Initiative. Her other roles, she spent quite a long time, I believe, at the UK's Department for International Development, now the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, and has also been Director of Programme Policy for Quality at Save the Children UK. And she did spend 12 years at Dfis, and I think her last position there was actually as the Deputy Director and Head of Private Sector Development. So we have an excellent, well-qualified panel, I think, to kind of scrutinise Paddy today. Okay, so as well as our small audience in the room, it's actually a real delight to be chairing an event and see people in person. We also have a large, over 300 registered online. So hello, everybody. We have everyone from all corners of the globe joining us today. Hello, welcome. Please do ask questions. So in the audience, just raise your hand. Online, there's a little box, I think, underneath the video stream. Please type in your questions. If you'd like to give us your name and affiliation, and I will do my best to direct the questions to the panel. So anyway, over to you, Paddy.
Thanks very much, Sam. And hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as Sam mentioned, a real novelty to be doing this in person. Here we go on the slides. So what I'm going to do today is present a extremely compressed version of a paper called The Economics of Development Finance, which is going to explain some of the thinking behind the development impact objectives that CDC is going to set itself for the next 5-year period. I'm sorry to say I won't be able to comment on much else of what's in the forthcoming strategy. You shall have to wait for the official launch, which I think is going to be in December, political winds permitting. So I've been allotted 15 minutes, so I'm really going to rattle through this presentation, but hopefully it'll whet your appetite and you can go and read the paper, which you can find online. So what's the purpose of this paper? So I'm really trying for simplicity and clarity here. Strategy, I was reading some strategy professors and they say that strategies often fail because they don't really ever clearly say what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. And it's very easy for an organization like CDC, which has a very open-ended mission of helping solve global development challenges, I think is the phrase, to end up with a very long list of desirable things that we want to do without a clear articulation of what our priorities are and hence what our performance should be judged against. So much of what I'm going to say here, I think, as Sam said already, is not really very novel. It's pretty standard economics, but that's deliberate. Across CDC, there's mountains of guidance papers and fine-grained sector strategies which dig into complexity. But here I'm trying to cut through complexity and try to place some points on our compass, so to speak. What we want to get to in the end is a clear idea of what a high-impact and a low-impact investment looks like. But we didn't want to just sort of hand people what we thought were the answers without explaining where it came from. So what we've tried to do in this paper is start from the kind of ground up and get to these answers that way. So forgive a bit of economics jargon, but a strategy is a constrained maximization problem. It has two parts. First, we want to know what's desirable, and then we can start thinking about what is possible. What it is realistic to expect once we take constraints into account requires knowledge about our markets and our capabilities and our resources, and the strategy that we will launch later this year will reflect all that. But today I'm just going to be talking about the first part, which is the what is desirable part. So that's my preamble out of the way. This slide covers what I'm planning to talk about for the rest of this session. So let's start with what is development and what has private sector investment got to do with it. So I would say that development is about improving lives and protecting the planet, or words to that effect. Now, a person's quality of life is about all sorts of things: dignity, rights, freedoms, but We are investors, and that means our domain is the economy. And that means that's largely about people's material standard of well-being, although I would add that kind of someone's experience at work is very important too. Now, in the language of economics, reducing poverty is the same thing as increasing consumption. Those statistics that we all look at on extreme poverty and poverty levels, that data is all about estimated levels of daily consumption. It's not about what we think of as consumer goods in rich countries. It's about food and housing and healthcare and all the components of a decent standard of living. So lots of people will not be able to consume at a high level unless the economy can produce lots of consumption goods and services per person. So an unproductive economy is a poor economy. Those are two sides of the same coin. Most people get their income from working, so their level of consumption is going to be set by their real income. That's their nominal wage in whatever currency relative to the prices of things they want to buy. So from an individual's perspective, you can get better off in two ways. Either your individual income increases because you've got a better job perhaps, or because the prices that you face fall relative to your income. And that can happen when the economy that you live in has got more productive and perhaps more competitive. So when a DFI makes an investment, we do that to raise productivity. And the benefits of doing that can go in two directions: to the firm, where it is shared between workers and investors, and to the customer, that enjoys a wider range of better products at lower prices, and economists call that consumer surplus. Investments have positive and negative effects on the productivity of other firms. Some they're going to help, others they might put out of business. So to size up the impact of an investment, you really want to add up the net change in the incomes of workers and customers across the economy. Now, if you've done that and you set that against the cost of the investment, you would have the beginnings of an impact return on investment calculation. So that's the first thing we do when we're trying to conceptualize what the impact of an investment is. But the second thing you'd want to do is you'd want to ask who benefits from those changes and then weight those benefits accordingly. $1 of higher income is worth more to a poor person than to a rich person, and anybody out there that's taken some economics classes will recognize that as the diminishing marginal utility of consumption. So quite how quickly the benefits of higher consumption on human welfare fall as you get richer is an answer without a sort of definitive, it's a question without a sort of definitive answer. But if you look in, for instance, the UK's cost benefit analysis handbook, you will see an assumption that the impact on welfare doubles each time initial income halves. So that means that increasing someone's consumption from $2 to $3 a day has the same impact on sort of human well-being as increasing it from 4 to 6 or from 10 to 15. So if you think about that, it's very powerful. You would be doubling the impact of $1 many times as you move from the richest to the poorest people in a society. And because our mission is to improve people's lives, then that means that the impact return on our investments judged against that objective is very influenced by who's benefiting from them. So I'm going to turn on to the protecting planet side of the problem here. So the word sustainable means different things to different people, but in economics, it means that our standard of living does not fall over the long run, which it's going to do if we wreck the planet, especially if you actually take the natural world to be part of our standard of living. So here we are investing in productivity to support a higher level of consumption for all, but climate change and the depletion of natural capital is negative investment, it's destruction. So you probably don't really need any more dire predictions about the effects of climate change. I know I don't, but here you go anyway. Some estimates say that unabated climate change would reduce GDP by 75% in the regions of the world where CDC invests by the end of the century, which, depending on what you assume about how fast growth would have been in the absence of climate change, means that these regions of the world could end up worse off at the end of the century than they are now. So what that means for DFIs is that any investment that helps shift the economy onto a sustainable footing has a big impact on our development mission. Any investment that looks good, both from what you might call a human development point of view in the short run, job creation, price reductions, but also makes a difference from an environmental point of view, that's like a win-win for us, a double whammy. Okay, so that was super quick. There's much more in the paper, but putting all this together, we kind of think that three things are needed from investment from the point of view of development. We need investments so that economies can grow to provide a decent standard of living and create jobs for all. We need investments to transform economic activity so it's environmentally sustainable, and we need investments that are going to share the benefits of these productivity improvements across all sections of society. And this very simple, basic kind of conclusion is where our 3 strategic development objectives come from. So those objectives are to make investments that are productive, sustainable, and inclusive. And of course, those are very kind of hard to disagree with, are high-level words. So what's really going to matter is how we operationalize those things, and that's the stuff that I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to talk about until we get to the actual strategy launch. But what I do hope to end up with is describing what we think a high-impact investment looks like, seen in this way, and the kind of things that we are going to be prioritizing in our new strategy. But before I get there, we've got to understand why we need DFIs, and then we put those things together, and that's what tells us where we can have the most impact. Okay, so a really obvious place to start is the fact that many businesses in Africa and Asia cannot always obtain the finance that they need on reasonable terms. That means that socially beneficial investments aren't happening. So a very simple reason for the existence of DFIs is to fill financing gaps. We're not going to be able to fill financing gaps from our own balance sheets. We are small and the problem is large. So whilst there are important, worthwhile projects that can't get the money they need, and we can have a very direct impact in that way, the kind of bigger potential is to do something at the system level, change how the financial sector works, and maybe also mobilize more investments beyond our balance sheets. We need public interventions in private markets because of what economists like to call market failures. And that means what's best for profit is not always what's best for society. So you're all doubtless familiar with the idea of a negative externality. So because the prices of coal or petrol didn't reflect the damage that was done by them, we burnt too much of them and we didn't put enough effort into developing alternatives. There are also positive externalities. So these are benefits that are enjoyed by society but are not reflected in private financial returns. So for instance, society benefits when there are more and better jobs around, but firms don't take that into account when they're making hiring decisions. There are also social benefits from learning from innovation and experimentation, and these are far larger than the private returns. When economists try to measure these things, they routinely come up with estimates of social returns that are 5 or 10 times higher than the private returns. So regulations, taxes, and subsidies are the main tools that a government might have to correct for these differences between private and social returns. But even wealthy countries, not the UK so far, but many others, with lots of fiscal capacity to afford subsidies and powerful institutions to enforce policies, still see the need for development finance institutions to make some investments happen that wouldn't otherwise. And governments in Africa and South Asia, which might have a bit less fiscal firepower, and maybe it might be harder to enforce regulations, the need for DFIs to find investments with large social benefits is even greater. We also need DFIs to push markets in more equitable directions. Markets are an engine of prosperity, but they go where there is money to be made, and you don't get awarded with extra profits from investments in poor countries or which directly benefit poor people. So DFIs can have different priorities from commercial investors and place a premium on investments that do that. A big part of tackling inequality is competition. When firms compete for workers and customers, wages go up and prices go down. When firms dominate their markets, they can hold wages down and prices up. Now, if we were purely commercial investors, we would love that. Market power is where super profits come from. It's how Warren Buffett made his billions, creating little monopolies. But because we're a DFI, we want to see more competition and not less. So we have to stay away from making powerful incumbents more powerful. Right, so that has covered very quickly what we need investments for and why we need DFIs to intervene. Putting these together will give us like what does high impact look like. So I'm going to run through our 3 objectives and try and pick out what a high impact investment looks like. But I want to emphasize before I do that these 3 words, these are the dimensions along which we measure the impact of every investment. It's not a matter of saying that this type of investment is productive, this type of investment is sustainable, although, of course, some will be stronger in some dimensions than the other. So starting with productivity, where can we find the really big social returns on this score? Well, the direct impact of higher productivity on workers and customers can be large and important, but as a rule, impact at scale is going to come from investments that affect many other firms. So, for instance, cheaper, more reliable internet access will result in lots of firms starting to do things that they couldn't do before, and investments taking place across the economy. And there's very high quality empirical evidence that reducing the price, increasing the quality and availability of what we call economic enablers, such as finance, connectivity, electricity, fertilizer, cement, and so on, can make a big difference to overall productivity in the economy and therefore into wages and prices. So in general, the question that CDC will be asking ourselves here is there a plausible sequence of events from this investment that will result in many other firms in turn making investments and raising their productivity? And broadly speaking, there are two ways of doing that. One is tangible, one is intangible. On the tangible side, we are talking about spillovers in production networks. So these are firms that make things that other firms use. And when there are complementarities, then the productivity in these networks and the productivity of some firms depends positively on the productivity of other firms. Economists sometimes talk about a binding constraint. And the idea there is that there are some things that at a particular point in time and in a particular place are really holding growth back. So that's what we are trying to focus on. I've mentioned things like power and fertilizer, but we do want to think a little bit more broadly. Finance is, of course, itself an input into production in a sense. And I also want to highlight the tradable sector and exports, which produce foreign exchange earnings, which can be a constraint on growth too. On the intangible side, we're looking at knowledge creation, and we're looking at investments that generate a competitive response. We call this catalyzing markets. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to be prioritizing there. Hope I'm all right for time. On the sustainability side, again, it's a similar story. I mean, we can have a considerable impact directly on greenhouse gas emissions. We can get big numbers by helping the largest carbon-intensive economies in the regions where we invest become lower emitters. But again, we might have a greater impact from investments that have these spillover effects. As a rule, we might make more of a difference by doing things that get a ball rolling rather than pushing on a ball that already has momentum. That might mean that we have to go into countries where the renewable sector is still immature. And then as the renewable sector matures, we've got to be thinking about where we can push back the next frontiers of decarbonisation. So that is industrial heat, sustainable agriculture, cooling, water. There are whole parts of the economy that have barely begun to decarbonise and become more resilient. In general, because there is still so much to learn about how to green the economy, then there is a great need for experimentation to find out what works. So the positive spillovers from new green business models and investments have the potential to be very large indeed. So last but not least, being inclusive. Now, our shareholder, the FCDO, is delighted when we are happy to reach the lowest income sections of the population in an efficient way, but they have better instruments for targeting extreme poverty than us. What they really want from us is to make these investments that advance structural change, and they will often have a more broad-based impact across society. That said, when we can find investments that directly reach the lowest income sections of society, they are a very high priority for us because they are high income. So to do that, we will be looking for investments that either create better jobs or are going to pull in people from the bottom of the income distribution at scale, or create opportunities for marginalized sections of society, including women, of course, or which reduce the prices of things that people buy. In East Asia, poverty reduction was helped by very large employers that could hire and train lots of low or semi-skilled workers. There are perhaps fewer such opportunities around today, but where we can find them, they are high impact. Increasingly, opportunities like that will be in the services sector rather than manufacturing. And then agriculture. So something like 80% of the people who live in extreme poverty are living in rural areas. And the evidence is pretty clear that productivity improvements in agriculture that reach a large number of farmers are where the most pro-poor investments can be found, at least in the short run. In the long run, a country will be unlikely to move from poverty to prosperity through agricultural improvements alone. And then finally, there are millions of people working in the informal sector in urban areas on very low and precarious livelihoods. So anything we can do to bring higher and more stable incomes to that segment of the population is a priority. The digital economy offers great promise here, creating new opportunities to reach people that couldn't be reached. But there are also risks. The gig economy is not necessarily a wholly good thing. That was very quick. Did I get through it on time? I'm done.
Yes,
so thank you very much,
great.
everybody, for listening. I look forward to hearing from our discussants and questions.
Thanks, Paddy. A lot to cover, and I would direct everyone to have a look at the paper. There's a lot of content there, but I think it's good to see kind of CDC narrowing down where it thinks along these kind of dimensions it thinks its investment will have the greatest impact. So Mohan, I'm going to talk to you about the productivity objective that Paddy's outlined. So he's outlined kind of 3 areas where he thinks DFI can have the most impact in terms of improving or raising productivity. And you sit in Africa, you work for the Development Bank of South Africa. So we're interested in your experience and perspective, I guess, from an African perspective, about how well do these kind of specific focus areas resonate with countries' needs? And are these the areas where you think, from your experience, DFIs can have the most impact in terms of kind of productivity and spillover effects?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation as well. Just a quick background. The DBSA, we are a South African national development bank based out of Johannesburg. And what we do is we focus around sustainable infrastructure projects, both in South Africa and the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So we're part of let's say, a universe of different development finance institutions in Africa. So there are others that, for instance, the Industrial Development Corporation that focuses more on, industrial investments, mining, factories, that type of thing. There's another institution, the Land Bank, that focuses on primary agriculture, agro-processing activities as well. So I suppose, when I'm speaking, it'll be focused a lot from an infrastructure perspective. And in that sense, I think the things that Paddy was speaking about are really, I think, quite spot on the productivity side. Because what we look for is, we look at infrastructure in 2 ways. One, on the economic side, having, good quality infrastructure in place at affordable prices is very important for economies in South Africa and the rest of the region to be able to grow, to become productive, to create jobs, and to allow for trade. And then on the other side, there are certain sectors of infrastructure that we invest around education, in healthcare, in social housing, that also, improve the quality of life of people in the continent as well. But certainly, the economic infrastructure that we focus on, whether it be in the power sector, transport and logistics, in telecoms and ICT investments, and even to a degree around water, especially bulk water, those are all absolutely crucial for getting the economies growing. And as Pat, rightfully, stated, if you can't get the economies of these countries to grow, then you're not going to be able to have more consumption for the people of the continent. And we know that the levels of poverty have not gone down anywhere near as much within Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, as we'd like to have seen, certainly compared to other parts of the world. So I think that focus on productivity, let's call it productive sectors, is really, really critical, and it aligns a lot with what the DBSA focuses on. So the way we think about it is to say, we want to focus on sustainable infrastructure, and that has elements of, the sustainability and the inclusivity bits, but it's also the first part, because if the infrastructure isn't economically viable, then, it's almost pointless, in the sense that, if you overspend on power, then the cost of that power is going to be such that industry can't, affordably pay for it and still produce what they need to produce, as an example. And similarly, households won't be, except for a few at the top, won't really be able to afford that power either, and that's one. Similarly, it could be, so you have to look at logistics as a chain and understand how do we deliver, productive logistics so that, it could be shipping, mining output through, through railways, to the ports and getting them out, but it could also be how you promote trade. One of the things we're looking at in South Africa is how do you connect the industrial heartland of South Africa around Johannesburg through an efficient transport network into the heart of Africa, through Southern Africa into the Great Lakes region, so that exporters and industry in South Africa is competitive vis-a-vis others who would, let's say, land goods into some of the ports in East Africa and then ship them through to the market. So that element of productivity is very, very important. I think the second part of the question then was around what are the challenges and opportunities we see. And I suppose I'll speak a little bit narrowly from the infrastructure space, because that's where we operate in. What is interesting is, on the one hand, I think it's clearly understood the scale of the investment that's needed in sub-Saharan Africa. In infrastructure alone, the need for investments is in the region of about $150 billion a year. That's about 5 to 6% of the GDP of the continent. Roughly, I think about 70, maybe 80 to 90 billion dollars is being invested. So it's still a gap, in that range. But if you think about other SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, then the level of investment is over $1 trillion a year, which is a significant portion of the GDP. So on the one hand, we have a lot of investments that need to be made. And what's also interesting is, as especially sitting here, there's significant pools of capital that are looking for decent yield. Certainly, in parts of continental Europe, for 10-year bonds, government bonds, you're earning negative yields. For instance, if you're buying German bonds as an example, here it's a little bit slightly positive, but it's nowhere near enough to pay for retirees to pay for their pensions and such. So there's a search for yield, and the good news is there's decent yield to be made in African infrastructure. And so, in fact, the reason I'm here for this week is there's a conference called the Africa Energy Forum, that's taking place here in London. I guess it's taking place here instead of in Africa because, a lot of the money is here, and you have to go where the money is. But the good news is, so the money is there and the need is there, but the challenge is the projects that are viable and are ready for investments are not there. And so that's something, and I think this speaks to some of the elements about the role of a DFI that Patty was speaking to. That's something that we've identified as the DBSA that we need to step into. So as an example, what we found is that the reason is that ultimately the regulatory and institutional framework that's needed to bring in these investments isn't there. And once that's set up, then significant amounts of private capital flows in. So, Patty's again absolutely right that, our balance sheets as DFIs and as, let's say, official development assistance, ODA, is simply not enough, right? I think the ODA is about $130 billion. To give you an idea, the DBSA's balance sheet is about $7 billion. We invest about $1 billion a year. And in infrastructure, meanwhile, we spoke about total requirements of over $150 billion. So, we have to be reliant on private capital to solve for this. But we have to create that, we meaning African governments and the donor and DFI community have to work together to create that investable framework that allows that capital to flow through. Because effectively, it is a sort of a public good, and therefore an individual private entity isn't necessarily going to make that kind of investment. I'd recently published a paper with the World Economic Forum on that Global Futures Council with some other writers, including a gentleman who ran the Triple P program in Colombia for the Rhodes program. And I gave examples from the DBSA's experience from the renewable energy program in South Africa. In both of those, we made significant investments upfront, working with government, putting in the legislative, the procurement frameworks, those types of elements, which then has enabled significant amount of private capital to flow through. So I think that's another example of the kind of investments that DFIs can be making that allows for productive investment to come through. So those are some of the types of work we're doing. Obviously, we'll then also step in because another gap, so beyond the dearth of projects, is then around risk capital, and which is one of the things that, So there's a lot of capital, but generally, a lot of it is on the debt side and senior debt side. There's less on equity. And so the role that the CDC is playing in providing equity capital for these kinds of investments is also quite crucial. And then I guess the last issue is just around, well, it's not the only one, but there's a significant issue around just making sure it's affordable, and therefore you have the off-takers that have the ability to pay for this. And here the challenge is, based on the tax base, the size of the economies, a lot of African governments and utilities just don't have the ability to afford a lot of the infrastructure. So you're kind of building, slowly, grow the economy. That adds to the GDP, it adds to the tax base, and then you can build some more and sort of continue to follow that kind of a path. So I'd say those are some of the challenges that need to be worked on.
Great, thank you, Mohan. So I think you've highlighted, the importance of infrastructure, but also there's quite a lot of interdependence between these objectives and some of the challenges. And if we have time, I know, Paddy, you can't talk about the kind of how, but Mohan's highlighted this issue, I think, around mobilization and the constraints of DFI balance sheets in light of the need, but also I think this issue around the importance of the enabling environment, and I guess how DFIs then work to kind of build that enabling environment to incentivize investment, especially in renewable energy. And of course, a big issue on risk capital. And CDC is different from many DFIs, because it does provide equity capital more so than many other DFIs. So I'm going to talk to Namita next. So Namita, I'd like to speak to you based on your expertise in kind of sustainable finance. Again, from your kind of experience and perspective, these kind of three areas that Paddy outlined on sustainability and what the most impactful investment might look like, how does that resonate, with countries in South Asia and your kind of experience in this area? Are these the areas where DFIs need to be investing?
Thank you very much, Samantha, and thanks a lot for inviting me here. It's indeed a pleasure. So, like Paddy and Mohan, put forward their points. I think, we are aware that DFIs that operate similarly to commercial banks, but slightly differently. And since their mandate or mission is more focused on the objectives of sustainable development, they also, in a way, provide a kind of a cyclical effect or an impact and the interlinkages between developmental parameters and the capital that is provided, So, energy access resulting in livelihood security, education, better healthcare. And they do have the appetite to take on more risk and have longer term perspective on project returns and developmental impact. So this is really the positive side. And I think this is really the key to scaling commercial capital, which focuses on climate or sustainable projects. And that is where we need more and more DFIs like CDCs and others to step in, where investments just don't deliver on the highest sustainability impact, but also provide for market-linked performance. Because as Paddy also mentioned, that private sector participants, private sector financiers would look at profits, and DFIs really are in the position to provide that additionality to the private sector. So, if you look at, for example, within the global south, the gap SDG funding requirement is of trillions. We heard Mohan speak about it, and we know that there is rapid work that is happening on, say, energy demand across South Asia. But there are challenges, and these are to be understood, and DFIs understand this very well, and these need to be then connected with that additionality part that I'm really talking about. So like projects which are energy projects which are linked to access or transition, linkages with inadequate production or transmission infrastructure, theft and safety of public goods, failure of policies, or even currency risks and high hedging costs. I think these are limitations why projects like these don't take off, right? And all this coupled with, again, private sector's apprehension on high risks of lending to communities or projects, and especially the one that Paddy mentioned, where you go into underserved markets. I think then there is a mismatch of expectations about acceptable and realistic returns on investment. So I think the big role here is to meet the requisite demands. And we heard about how, risk mitigation mechanisms that have been brought out by Dfis is really helping bridge that capital gap. And one other priority area, and I think this is very important here, is how do we help leverage private investments to address specific challenges. So just take India, for example. Energy solutions, last mile delivery is a test. And as geographic areas are either underserved or beyond the reach of the grid, then there are communities with low income, there is high vulnerability, scarcity of resources, and this also leads to low levels of energy consumption and factors that are really impossible for commercial capital to enter. Now, on the other side, if you look at India's COP26 commitments, 50% renewable energy generation by 2030, and this is a huge market opportunity for Dfis to look at how do you bundle products and bundle products along with private sector lenders. I think that is a very, very important aspect to be able to create that real impact. And then there's one other thing that Paddy mentioned, which I found very interesting, in fixing the weak links. And I had thought about a point here, which was about how CDC like Dfis can play the key role of an aggregator, given its objectives, bringing together. I mean, in case of energy, clean energy, for example, bringing together energy end users, the energy providers, and the ecosystem developers, all who are a cog in the energy delivery wheel, and all of these have their own motivations and own priorities, right? I mean, each one comes with that own priority. So how do you bring together, how do you fund capacity building, training, how do you intervene policies at different country levels? I think that is very, very, very critical. And one final point on, because there is also this whole opportunity that is coming from hard to decarbonize sectors, right? I think the region as a whole is home to some of the world's largest emitters, as we know. And we've heard how much a number of times that the global efforts to fight climate change really depend on Asian countries cutting their reliance on coal or, moving towards a low carbon production. Now, towards this, I think, transition and the whole transition finance and facilitating that becomes very, very important from Dfi's perspective. So I hope in CDC's strategy that will be unfolded or will be revealed, there is capital moving towards these kind of mechanisms, and I think those are the areas that really need to be fueled, if I may say. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Namita. And so, do you see any particular kind of opportunities or challenges in the kind of approach of CDC or the sectors that they've identified or Paddy's identified?
So I was mentioning that there is COP26 has served a lot of buzz and action from governments and the vigor that we've seen with all the pledges that have been brought out. But I think the proof of the pudding is to see how all these targets are actually met, all conditional, unconditional, and all commitments, right? So that's really how we look at it. Now, for example, over the last 4 years, CDC has invested over $1 billion in climate finance across Africa and South Asia. It has made recent commitments to invest $1 billion in climate funding in India, that's building upon its already existing $1.99 billion portfolio. Very rightly, Mohan mentioned, while debt capital is available, I think equity is much harder. And we've seen how with one of the large banks fund, CDC is looking at mobilizing equity and accelerating climate investments in the country. I think, by contributing to these kind of developmental agenda in countries particularly, would be able to create a larger footprint. I think one very important point here is, DFIs like the CDC lead the pack. I mean, we've seen how IFC, EIB, they all have, including CDC, have the wherewithal to channel funding of scale and leave a greater footprint in the project that they have been working on, right? And especially in emerging markets, what we've seen is the local DFIs are lagging, and this is on the back of challenges like lack of understanding of sectoral risks, or a need for stronger balance sheets or capital, project execution delays, inability to obtain resources at competitive prices, and attracting talent because they are disadvantaged at absolute remuneration levels, right? So I think, with all this, there is an opportunity for organizations like CDC to be able to work with the local DFIs, so that then that alpha gets really created in the areas that he has mentioned as priorities, right? I think that would be a very important aspect to look at. So, looking at a good investment strategy which is already there, and how do CDC enables the local DFIs, and how do they get folded into the larger objective of using scarce public capital to catalyze the rising of multiple private capital, or addressing the perceived risks which serve as barriers for private sector to entry, weaving in instruments like blended capital, first loss guarantees, partial guarantees, or cash covers. I think these are very, very important aspects to address the vulnerabilities that sit within, and would then provide or create ample headroom for growth and delivery, to be able to create the necessary impact. One other thing I wanted to, one other thing which is more of a question, but it is also something that I wanted to put forth here, that, impact return on investment. We saw social return on investment way back in the 2016, 2015, 2016, evolving. But impact return on investment that Paddy mentioned about, this is a very important aspect of looking at investments. And how would we evolve with the frameworks or the formulas to be able to calculate that? I think that would be very, very important, because that should link to also measuring the risks and the returns, which include the profitability that the investors, or financial institutions who would want to partner would really look at. So I would stop there, and over to you, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Namita. In the interest of time, I won't attempt to summarize, but I think, again, I've picked up some themes coming through. Some of it's on the how. I think this issue around kind of bridging, and I think kind of engaging with the private sector, scale and mobilization, high risk capital. But also, I think you were talking about ways of working with local DFIs, so ways of working in terms of how to achieve this. Mavis, I'm going to turn to you now. We're going to just home in, I think, on the inclusive side of the objectives. I think this is super interesting and quite new, I would say. I haven't seen this as an explicit kind of high-level objective from many DFIs. So I think you might be one of the firsts, Paddy. But also, just, we did this review, you probably know, a while ago on kind of the impact of DFI investment. And we actually found we didn't know a lot about the distributional impact of DFI investment. And you said yourself, there may be some better approaches to kind of tackle some of this issue, but that where these opportunities exist, you would obviously seek them out. So Mavis, kind of how well do the focus areas, which Paddy, the sectors that he kind of outlined, fit from your perspective in terms of tackling this agenda?
Thank you, Sam. So, and thank you to ODI for inviting us to this conversation. So I'd like to begin by commending Paddy and his team on the analysis they have done. And I really welcome the focus on increased productivity, sustainability, and inclusiveness. And I think they are critical issues that governments on the continent are really trying to navigate and grapple with as they think through their build forward plans post-COVID, especially at a time when they are navigating very tight fiscal spaces, and also rightly concerned about the time it's going to take for them to build back their economies. And this is something that, as I said, we are encouraging governments to look at, really asking them to think about long-term transformative growth. How do you lay the foundations for long-term transformative growth? How do you ensure that the growth that you are investing in, enables you to diversify your economies so that you can withstand shocks, enhance your productivity, and diversify your export base, ensure you enable you are able to take advantage of technology, and in all of this contributing to improved human well-being. So I think what CDC has laid out is at the heart of what we are all encouraging governments to look at as part of their building forward better plans. I also think the focus on manufacturing, services, agricultural, urban, informal economy, digital economy are all critical areas that we know are key to growth on the continent. So I don't disagree with any of them. I mean, some of the things that we would like to see unpacked further is when CDC says it's going to focus on agriculture, what does that actually mean? For us, you have to have climate smart agriculture. You've got to think about agribusinesses. We are not seeing enough DFI investment in agri-tech, and agri-tech is a critical growth area and an area for real employment generation for the continent. If you're going to go into some of these areas, you've got to really think about risk insurance and the importance of light manufacturing. There were two areas that you did not flag, but I know are in your past strategies. So the whole area of transportation and logistics is a critical area if we are going to see inclusivity in your investment. And also when you're thinking about energy, as both Mohan and Anita has said, renewable energy is really important. One area that I felt did not come out strongly, Patty, in the presentation is the extent to which you're going to go into small and medium enterprises. I mean, these are the largest generator of jobs. They are starving of finance, as you said in your paper. In Ghana, we know that, we have 90,000 MSMEs registered every year, and the successful medium enterprises each generate 46 jobs. So when you aggregate it, is a lot of jobs, and the continent desperately needs jobs. So how are these investments really going to focus on small and medium enterprises? Secondly, when you look at these areas, really think about brownfield investments where they have potential to grow and develop, have the ability to link into regional and global value chains. And you really need to think about how are CDC investments facilitating African businesses to take advantage of the continental free trade area. Again, we did not see that come out strongly in the paper. And then you talked about technical assistance. We really welcome that. But that technical assistance needs to be broadened to counseling and mentoring support to MSMEs. And here you might consider partnering with organizations that are supporting SMEs to become investment ready. So these are points that colleagues have already spoken about, but I just want to re-emphasize it because I think for your investments to be truly inclusive, you need to unpack the how a bit more and look at some of these elements. For me, there are three challenges to achieve this. The first one is, CDC's transition to the vision you've outlined in the paper. So between 2011 and 2019, you invested 1.7 billion in sub-Saharan Africa. 17% of this was in low-income countries and 83% was in upper and lower middle-income countries. I know that a large number of Africa's poor live in upper and lower middle-income countries, but you cannot ignore the low-income countries. When you aggregate them, they have a major impact. But most importantly, when the low-income countries are not doing well and we see conflict, it spills over into upper and lower middle-income countries. So how are you going to find that balance in investment? Secondly, in 2017, the largest share of your investment was in the financial sector, with over 65% of this in finance, followed by utilities. Now, we looked across your numbers between 2011 and 2019, and it's a bit more balanced, but the bulk of it, 34%, was in infrastructure, 20% was in construction and real estate. Then you got to manufacturing, 18%, and 17% in food and agriculture. You have an ambitious new area. So how is that going to happen? I think for us to really know whether your investments are inclusive, you need to be more transparent in your reporting so we can see how your strategy is truly driving transformative growth and inclusivity on the continent. So we were looking at your past reports, and I was really struggling to see, okay, to what extent is this infrastructure investment really inclusive? And to what extent is this energy investment truly inclusive? So it would be important to have that information to be able to say, yes, these investments are really driving inclusivity. Poor people are getting access to power. Poor people are really benefiting in urban areas. We're beginning to see a growth. We're beginning to see income increases, not directly, but even indirectly, to be able to get that data. And then I have a bit of a cheeky one, which is, does your board have the risk appetite to do the kind of investments that are required to see real investment, real inclusivity? The second area is direct versus intermediation. And Amita also touched on this. You said in your paper that you are looking increasingly at direct investment. I think you have a much stronger role to play in intermediation if you are going to realize inclusive investment. One is leveraging local investment, including working with local Dfis and equity funds. Your participation in these Dfis and equity funds will enhance governance, will enable you to, drive the green and sustainable investments, really help them to think through productivity, all the ambitions you have. And it might also enable you to facilitate greater investments in the low-income economies that often have nascent finance sectors and are difficult for Dfis to go in. And finally, just repeating what Mohan and Hamita has said, which is African governments just need to create the enabling environment for this to work. It's one thing for us to all sit here and say, you've got to do ABC, but the enabling environment becomes critical. Sam, that is everything from me. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mavis. You've clearly done your homework and know CDC very well, and also I think have articulated quite clearly, I think, some challenges. One for some, to unpack some of the detail, but also some of these important challenges and the transition, I guess, that's going to occur, that transformation as CDC continues to evolve. But also touch on this issue, I think, about how do we, I think your objective is measuring impact and conceiving impact when you're talking around inclusiveness, kind of the productivity and spillovers. I think there are big implications there for how you go about conceptualizing, measuring and managing for impact. So without further ado, going to open the floor to some questions. We've had them coming online, so they're coming to me. So I've got an immediate question from this gentleman here in the audience. If you could introduce yourself, please. Probably doesn't need a lot of introduction. And then I will take a question online.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I'm Dirk de Velde from ODI and also a professor at SOAS. I thought the presentation was really good. Thanks, Paddy, for the excellent presentation. And the ambition is really great to see sort of on transformation, measuring spillover effects. 5 years ago, about 5 years ago, ODI launched the 5-year strategy of CDC, and it promised to develop whole sectors. And so that is sort of the transformation that we'd like to see. You would need to measure spillover effects. And so my question is a bit sort of thinking about your paper, if you can make it go a bit more alive in the sense of what evidence have we seen in the past 5 years that CDC investments have focused on, say, the weakest link and have therefore had transformative effects. Or if you can't see that, and if you haven't got examples of what CDC has done to have transformative effects, what should it do differently? what should it then do differently? Should it target different sectors differently? Should it focus more on spillover effects, managing the spillover effects? So just like some examples.
Thank you, Dirk. Paddy, do you want to briefly respond to that question?
Yeah, and maybe a few words also about the from the discussants as well.
Okay.
Quite raise some things, but do you want to take a question online before?
I can, yes. I've got questions. They seem to be for you, Paddy. But maybe yeah. If you just respond to that question, and then we might get some questions in some of the other areas.
Well, there's so much here. I really need to I'd need another hour to do justice to all these questions. So I'll just sort of randomly pick at things that I think I can say something quickly about. So I'm going to start with Mohan, and just to point out that I think that, it was before my time, but I think our thesis with Power has always been, for instance, we wanted to put more time and more effort into project development. So we like to get these projects going. I think that Dfis are moving more into upstream advisory. It's like CDC has always had technical assistance, but I think we could go further into working upstream to create more opportunities. So that could be good. But I wanted to say something about, so we have financial parameters. We have to get our money back. And some of the things that you might want to do in Power in Africa might require more concessional capital. So there is, we've just come out of Glasgow, and I can't pretend that I've managed to digest everything that was said about new funds, but I think that this making more really concessional capital, grant capital even, available for Dfis to work with to do more pioneering investments in Power is something that we're going to need to see happen. I've got to do a bit of a kind of corporate bragging, I guess, because I've got to talk about, people have talked about our equity appetite, but we also do things like, which I don't believe other Dfis do, which was we'll even do startups, wholly owned subsidiaries. And one of those was in India, which I hope you're familiar with, Namita, called Ayana, which was set up to originally push into the lower income states that were being neglected. And that's now got to a point where, rather than us putting more of our own money into that vehicle, we are now raising money from, that business is now raising money from other places. So that's an example of sort of this mobilization story coming. And a place like India, I remember we looked at the renewables market, and I think, you might think, well, India, huge economy, doing really well. They don't need any money for renewables. And then you actually look at how much money they, like all these renewable plans are going to cost, and then you go down the list of which banks seem to be actively funding them, and like what the supply of capital looks like, and you've still got an enormous gap. So that, there really is what additionality in renewables. I think we can be. There's a great need for capital there for sure. I don't know what else I should talk to you about. Mavis, like the questions you raise about SMEs and intermediaries, and then also the share of our portfolio which goes into the financial sector, I think those are all part of the same answer. I think when people look at our balance sheet, they go like, why is CDC investing in banks? Well, it's because we want to reach SMEs. That is one of our primary routes to them. And I think that some of the upstream work I was just referring to might be part of what you were talking about with mentoring and that kind of thing. That's something that we haven't previously done a lot of. I want to talk about, you mentioned low-income countries and lower middle-income countries and how much we invest in each. I don't need to tell you this, but countries like Nigeria, they might be a lower middle-income country, but they are also, I think, going to be the single country home to the largest number of people living in extreme poverty in the world. So sometimes when we get criticized for investing too much in Nigeria, I'm always thinking, I'd like us to invest more in Nigeria. And also lower income countries, I think this is just a coincidence. Well, maybe it isn't a coincidence. Are quite often small countries in terms of their population, and some of these lower middle income countries are large countries in terms of population. So if you think about the investment opportunities being roughly proportionate to the size of GDP, then I think it makes more sense to, when you look at where we invest, to sort of normalize, like, are we investing more as a percentage of GDP in low-income countries than we are in lower middle-income countries? Is I think is the better test. And I think last time I looked at the numbers, I wish I'd rehearsed that before coming here. Now the spillover effects and the inclusivity of an infrastructure investment, a grid scale power generation, for instance, that's a genuinely hard question to answer. And it's not the kind of thing we can report. I mean, you can't just sort of ask the company to tell us who's benefiting from this power you've put onto the grid. Particularly as the impact chain there goes into businesses hiring people, creating jobs, lowering prices. It's a complicated chain, but you can look to academic research and get. I think that CDC was one of the earliest investors into the Ugandan distribution company. And I recently saw a great paper that used machine learning and satellites and all this kind of stuff to show that the extension of the grid didn't have it previously, had a marked impact on poverty reduction, and that's kind of supportive of what we do. But it's not the kind of thing that we're going to be able to sort of put in our annual reports every year. So I think that maybe I should beg our shareholder for more money for research and evaluation so we can fund these terrifically sort of interesting studies. And Dirk, well, I mean, in a way, you could say that the change in this strategy is to think a bit more about the forward effects of investments and spillovers. And previously, our last strategy, it was still quite looking at the jobs involved in producing things and not so much the forward effects. But I mean, I think that investing in the financial sector is an economic enabler. If you're getting credit at scale to firms that couldn't get credit, I think that investments in power are examples of these things with forward linkages. I mean, I think we've done some fertilizer investments, cement, I believe, but that's the kind of thing that, again, we could be continuing to look at. I mean, and I know that you're a great advocate of investment in manufacturing. I think we all want to do more there. I think that sometimes maybe the additionality screen and the ticket size screen can be a problem with us in manufacturing, because maybe you've got a bit of a dilemma where the really big manufacturers don't necessarily need our help, and if it's not big, it's harder for us to do. So I think that maybe that's part of the reason why manufacturing could be well, it's historically proven tricky for us. I'd better stop this. I've got about a dozen questions written down here, but I've got to stop.
So I'm just to be balanced, I've just got a couple of questions online, and then I can see some hands up in the audience. So Paddy, this is from Jürgen Vermeulen from FMO. He says, the 3 pillars outlined in CDC strategy align strongly with SDG 8. Was there a deliberate link to this SDG, or on purpose no mention of the SDGs yet in your analysis?
So I think on purpose no mention yet, because these 3 things, I see the connection with SDG 8. I hope I can remember which one it is. But I mean, you could sort of see that this productivity, these 3 dimensions are kind of there in a lot of the SDGs. When we announce our strategy and we start talking about how we're going to measure our progress and our impact scoring, you're going to see that part of our system is going to be sort of assigning investments against different development needs, and those development needs will be SDG connected. So there is going to be an integration with the SDGs once you get into the weeds of how we're going to implement the strategy, but okay. I'm not there yet.
Yeah, SDG 8, sustainable and inclusive growth.
Yeah.
So I will just ask just another one, from someone online. A question for Mohan, an anonymous question, Mohan. So this is, what role can Dfis play in context of fiscal consolidation and budget cuts to service delivery and thus lowered quality of living? For example, in South Africa's case, with high unemployment, would competition between industries ensure more jobs, or would it lower the floor of wages with such a high availability of job seekers? And how can Dfis support the long-term ability to create and sustain decent jobs? Gosh, that's a long question. Did you get it all?
It is quite long. And obviously I'm not an expert on all the different sub-elements there, but I think the one part that I can speak to is around this question of the fiscal. in South Africa now, the debt to GDP levels are about 70%, which is quite high given the cost of borrowing in South Africa, right? And it's similarly an issue in a number of African countries, especially in Southern Africa and even East Africa. And so part of it was certainly in infrastructure. The mechanism that was being used was countries were borrowing money to be able to invest in infrastructure. They were borrowing on balance sheet through the sovereign. And it had some benefits if it was a good quality infrastructure. But as we know, there's been other infrastructure, certain railways, certain other investments that haven't had the productive benefit that we'd like to see coming through. So the countries were taking on the extra debt, but they weren't having the benefits on the productivity side. So what we were trying to push for, and I think in a certain way COVID is helping along because of the fiscal crunch, is that a lot of governments are now having to do this where they have to say, we can't just take on more debt anymore on the sovereign balance sheet. We have to create opportunities for private sector investment to come through. Now, it may well mean then that certain critical investments don't happen because, as has been mentioned, the private sector won't invest there, but still scarce resources from the government can still go to those. Meanwhile, you're then opening up other more productive areas where the private sector can invest, and they'll only invest if they can be repaid, right? So, in that sense, at least from a financial basis, it is productive assets that are coming in, and that is putting less of a strain, directly on the sovereign balance sheet. And if over time, then the government's able to capture the tax revenues as a portion of that investment, then that does help. So I think that's a way where, the support that we can put as DFIs to have private sector investment, into areas like infrastructure will help, manage this kind of constraint that's coming through from the fiscus.
Okay, thank you. I think there's a question, Amy, and then Deepak. Maybe we'll take a couple of questions from the floor, please.
Great. Well, I'll try and be quick then. I think one of the challenges we all say CDC is great, and it sort of opens you up to the criticism: do more, do better, do it faster, all of those sorts of things. I do wonder, given the size and scale of sort of increased UK investment in CDC, like at what point do we cross is it still our best buy line? And I know we've sort of had this question before. It's an unfair one to ask CDC. Maybe it's a broader question to the panel. But I guess what I'm wondering is, I feel like you're shifting from a focus more solely on jobs to this sort of raise the consumption floor question. But we also know the consumption floor has stayed pretty static over recent years, probably the last 10 or 15 years, if we're being fair. So if we're not sort of getting that investment, and maybe this sort of goes to Mavis's point about if we're not investing in those sort of worst places and genuinely lifting that up, what are we kind of getting out of that? And is it the right sort of balance of investment? I guess it's kind of, Dirk's question a little bit, like, how do we shift the needle? Where is it that we're actually getting that additional impact if CDC is not quite set up to work in low-income countries or the very poorest countries or reach the very poorest people? And in the context of what we're facing in the pandemic, I find that trade-off has become much more acute.
Okay, thank you. I'll take those two questions then, and then
Thank you. Andy Hinsley, FCDO. So I really like the three focus areas. I guess the question is, are they pillars or are they a Venn diagram? And are you aiming at the intersections? How do you think about the trade-offs between those areas? So perhaps a couple of examples. If we think that export-focused manufacturing is getting a lot less job-intensive in lower income countries, does that make it a less attractive place to invest, or should we be doing it anyway and just have separate investments focused at creating labor demand? And then we know, from environmental Kuznets curve type theories that industrialization tends to lead to a process of environmental degradation followed by improvements after that. Is that something we just kind of ride the curve of, or do you kind of go in immediately at areas that can hit both the productive and sustainable type areas?
thank you. And one last question at the back of the room.
Thank you. Great question for me to follow on from. Ipek Gensu from the Climate and Sustainability team here at ODI. You might know what's coming. So from Glasgow, we've seen that policy and flows of finance are always one step behind where science is. And, you spoke of risk, everyone spoke of risk. We know what the biggest risk is, right? So do you think it's time for CDC to be very bold and simply end all financing for fossil fuel investments? Because, you know, Mohan, Namita, Mavis, everyone mentioned, and you yourself, the renewables gap, and, you know, balancing all the different pillars or Venn diagram components. Is it time to be really bold and make the commitment? You know, the UK has made a commitment to end international financing, now being followed by many other countries. But CDC still continues to support fossil fuels, so far understandably for other reasons around energy access, etc. But science also shows that you know, gas is not really a bridge fuel, and we need to only save those for those very exceptional circumstances around, you know, emergency, etc. But generally, as a rule, do you think in operationalizing the plan, that could be a good commitment for CDC? Thanks.
So you've got three questions there. I just thought maybe just bring in Namita, kind of your perspective, maybe perhaps just on this last question around DFI financing and, if you like, fossil fuels. And I think it speaks to some issues around just transition. I expect you might have a view on this. So we'll bring in your perspective from the country, and then hand over to Paddy, and then I think we'll need to wrap up. And Mavis, I haven't forgotten about you. I'll bring you in as well. Perhaps after Paddy's spoken. So maybe Namita, would you like just some quick reflections on this issue around DFI financing, if you like, of fossil fuels?
Yeah, thanks, Sam, for thanks for the question, the colleague from ODI. And see, you know, after COP, we've also seen how you know, there are countries like India, US, or China really you know, pitched for the phase down rather than the phase out as far as fossil fuels are concerned. And I think sitting in an emerging market or sitting in India, I believe that, you know, there has to be a balance in how finance is flowing towards, you know, these areas like fossil fuel. So I really don't know if we can, if there is a phase, even for an institution like CDC to look at how they can phase gradually the investments that they have made or they are already making, because drastic steps are not something that are going to be useful. On the other hand, there is a huge opportunity for renewable energy, as I mentioned, across you know, markets, and but the approach has to be in a way balanced, if I may point out. So sitting here, I really don't know if we could just go out. I know it sounds you know, when we talk about clean coal, for example, for India, it's good, maybe moving to clean coal to start with, and maybe in some of the developed markets, that's not something that financiers would like to look at. I think a gradual kind of an approach is something that we would really need to look at. And, you know, I take your point on, you know, that policy and finance is a step behind science, and like for businesses or for the finance community, we have science-based targets. I think we need to move you know, DFI's strategy also to be linked to SBT kind of an approach, and then look at what are the priority markets, because ultimately you're linking that to the larger strategy that you would want to you know, develop and show results on, right? Show the impact on. So how do you say, because coal-based economy today, you know, India has almost 52% generation. I mean, that is also creating jobs, and that is also you know, providing livelihood security. And we need to look at a transition which is just so it can't be a drastic you know, kind of a measure, but it would need to be a gradual strategy, working with those governments to look at how they want to plan their action against the commitments that they have taken. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. I'm a bit mindful of time. Have you got maybe 5 more minutes, Paddy? And Mohan? Okay, sorry. Mohan.
Yeah. Look, I think, you know, my own view is, you know, those kinds of calls aren't helpful in promoting economic development, especially in emerging countries, right? You know, the reality is, if you think about development banks, our focus is around, you know, clean, sustainable energy. that's where the funding is actually going. There are, in some cases, where it does make sense, to have a bit of a mix, to have some, some need for instance, natural gas as an example. It's a strong internal discussion we've been having at the DBSA as well. In fact, the Green Climate Fund, which we belong to, delayed our reaccreditation, because they saw that we were funding some fossil fuel projects, and that was being blocked by Sweden and by France. I guess France has a lot of nuclear power plants, so they're okay. They're connected to Germany and Poland, that's burning lignite and whatever else that they tend to burn. So it's it's easy for them. A lot of the country, and I think in the case of South Africa as an example, we can invest a lot in renewable energy because we already have a lot of baseload energy, and there's already a plan in place to significantly decommission the existing coal-fired power plants and then to invest in renewables. So that's something that's possible even in South Africa. But if you take a country like Madagascar, which is an island, it's not connected to the Southern African power pool. It's a country of 25 million people, and the generation capacity is 500 megawatts. So, that's 1% of the generation capacity of South Africa with half the population, to say, and they're already burning heavy fuel oil for generating power. So it may well be that, switching to natural gas until storage prices drop to a case, with battery storage, that you can go towards battery storage. So I think this is why I'm saying it's not always that helpful, because, you have to have that broader view. But the reality is, it's also not, from my perspective, it's not worthwhile getting down in that debate, because it's actually a very small percent of the investments, that we make as development finance institutions. The majority of the investments are in renewables, in transmission grids, in, transport and logistics, those other elements, social housing, education, healthcare. So even in each of those, you can look to say, how do we make buildings more green? But the fact that you're putting up a building, it's going to have a negative impact on the environment if you think about it that way. To say anytime you use concrete and steel and all of these things, those items consume, the production of those items, do consume, I guess, greenhouse gas. So but we need to develop it. I think it's about developing in a sustainable manner, and that's how we look at making balanced investment choices.
Excellent. I thought it'd be useful just to hear some perspectives. It's a challenging issue. So maybe Paddy, if you just reflect on some of those questions that have been put.
So Amy, I mean, the consumption floor is the level of consumption, the absolute minimum we observe in society. So that's not below extreme poverty, and reaching people like those directly would be very tough for a DFI. And I think that donor governments have better tools than us to do it. But in a recent paper, we looked at correlations in the data, and what we found is that for every percentage increase in the rate of private investment in an economy, on average, there's a 2% increase in the rate of decline in the extreme poverty headcount. So there is a statistical association between higher private investment and a faster extreme poverty reduction. Obviously, correlation and causation is a bit of a messy thing, but there is a reason to think that there are kind of spillover effects from growth onto extreme poverty. Trade-offs, Andy. So in a way, a scoring system is a way of embodying your view on these trade-offs, and that when we do, let's say you are looking at the environmental Kuznets curve, a manufacturing plant that's carbon intensive, or let's say something like that, that's going to kind of not be good in our scoring system, and then the other bits better be good, otherwise it's not going to get a high score, and we can't do too many low scoring investments. So we're this is a way of scoring investments, and thinking about these three dimensions is a way of making these trade-offs visible and managing them. So I think that's what I will say on that. So on gas, so our policy, in case anybody doesn't know it, as is in the Paris Agreement, the emissions of LDCs are permitted to rise a bit more before they fall, as they need for their development needs. We have a policy of only doing gas if it is deemed to be Paris aligned under exceptional circumstances. You can go online and search for our gas guidance note, and that will tell you when we do that. So let's think about those exceptional circumstances. Now, I'm not a power expert, so all I can do is tell you it as I understand it, okay? So some parts of the power system need to be able to deliver power not just 24 hours a day, but in those periods where the sun hasn't shone for a while and the wind hasn't blown. And as I understand things, the price for trying to put that together with renewables and storage is something like, I mean, you can't say anything too general, but something like 2 or 3 times more expensive than it would be for an indigenous gas plant right now. So you're asking an African government to spend 2 or 3 times more on this important part of delivering reliable and affordable power. I think that anybody who is thinks of themselves as an anti-poverty campaigner ought to think pretty carefully about a policy that increases the prices of power in the poorest countries in the world. I think that the Dfis are committed to phase out gas power in 2030. My personal view is that it is time for, let's say, European governments to stop investing in fossils, and then maybe they can start making it harder for low-income countries to do that. And I think the right time for us to stop investing in gas is when it's no longer needed. And there's a lot we can all do to bring that closer, that point in time closer. And there are investments that need to be made in transmission and distribution. We need to see those pioneering investments in energy storage starting to make themselves shown on the African continent, and so that the entire system can learn how to manage high levels of variable renewable energy sooner. So, I mean, as Mohan said, it gets a lot of attention, but I mean, in terms of the carbon emissions that we're talking about from a few 500 megawatt gas power plants on the African continent, I mean, it's quite obscene, really, that in a way we're talking about that when there is such enormous emissions in the rest of the world. So I think that's enough on that topic.
Okay, Mavis, I'm just mindful you're there in Accra. I'm just wondering, Paddy kind of responded a little bit to some of the challenges you raised. Do you have any further comment you'd like to add just before we close the event?
I just had 2 quick comments for Paddy. Paddy, unfortunately, when you use the word inclusive in your strategy, you take away the choice of whether a country has 25 million or it has 200 million. So just something for CDC to think about. And in asset, we always say that when Nigeria sneezes, it affects Niger. But when Niger gets upset, it has a knock-on effect that really throws Nigeria off balance. So just think about the interconnectivity of those countries and their impact on each other, and also the fact that a poor person is a poor person. And the second point on, it would be really wonderful to see the increase in SME investments from your finance investments, given the numbers we are seeing are not seeing an increase in those sectors. So maybe targeting SMEs will get you closer to that inclusivity target. That was it.
Thank you, Mavis. Namita, do you want any quick closing observations, comments, but quick?
Thanks. I just wanted to, because we were on the topic of power and there's so much spoken about it. I just had one comment for Paddy, and that is really, we've seen how, International Solar Alliance has been instrumental in bringing together 122 countries for cooperation among the solar resource rich countries, right? So I think the opportunity here is for all Dfis, and CDC has the opportunity to take the lead to collaborate, to harness a kind of a collective potential and draw on the ethos of one sun, one world, one grid to a one agenda, one world, one development for accelerating the overall global sustainable finance and climate transition. So I thought that was a very interesting point to look at. Thank you.
Namita and Mohan, maybe some reflections or last quick reflections, observations, comments.
No, I mean, I think in general, what we've heard so far, really aligns with what the DBSA is seeing and trying to do on the African continent. So it's very positive, and I think the focus on productivity and helping to grow the economies is one that's very aligned to what African governments and entities are trying to do, because we understand only by growing our economies can we create enough wealth to help solve a number of the social problems that are there on the continent.
Okay, well, we've run over time, but I just wanted to thank everybody online and in the room for your active engagement and questions, and also My thanks to the panelists, Namita and Mavis, participating virtually, and Mohan and Paddy. Thanks for coming here today. We've run out of time, so I won't summarize everything. This will be made available, I think, in a couple of days online. So if people want to share it with colleagues who you think might be interested, but also if you've enjoyed today's event, we have another event coming up on the 30th of November, which is the role of China in the multilateral development banks. So please register and tune in for that. And thank you, everybody. Thank you.